Hey there, Feliz Cinco de Mayo. So Russian humor can be very, very dark, and Russian people have suffered through a great deal, including winter after deep, dark winter of bone-chilling cold. And I know I experienced one of them, not in Russia, but in Ukraine, close enough. And they also suffered through a lot of unspeakable horror at the hands of their leaders. And even through all of that, the Russian people managed to crack jokes that highlight their plight and yet make fun of their situation. So in the jokes made by Russians living under various Soviet leaders, you can see the communist mentality begin to change through time. So the most crushing and vicious of the Soviet leaders was Joseph Stalin, who led the USSR from 1924 to 1953. Here's a Russian joke that used to be told about Comrade Stalin. So Comrade Stalin is speaking before a large crowd of communist leaders. Suddenly, someone lets fly a loud sneeze. "Who sneezed?" demands Stalin. No one speaks. "Very well," says Comrade Stalin. "First row, stand up." They do. "Kill them all." They are all shot. "All right, comrades," demands Stalin. "Who sneezed?" Still no answer. "Second row, stand up," he says, and they are all shot. "Comrades," barks Stalin, "we will continue this procedure until we find who sneezed." Finally, a sobbing man stands up from the back row. "It was me, Comrade Stalin," the man wails. "It was me." "Oh," says Stalin. "God bless you." Then he continues with his speech. Next is a joke about Nikita Khrushchev, who led the USSR from 1953 to 1964. His softer touch contrasted with Stalin's reign of terror, as can be seen by this much softer joke about him. So Khrushchev makes an official visit to a state-run pig farm, where he poses for a picture with the fattened-up pigs ready for slaughter. And the picture will be proudly published in Pravda, the communist newspaper, highlighting the benefits of state-controlled pig farms. However, the editors at Pravda need to write an impressive caption, and here were a couple of their ideas. Comrade Khrushchev among pigs. No, that's not going to work. Comrade Khrushchev in pig pen. No, that's not going to work either. And so none of their ideas work well because they sound too politically offensive to Comrade Khrushchev. So the next day, when Pravda hits the newsstands, the picture is printed on the front page, and underneath it, the caption reads, "Third from left, Comrade Khrushchev." Another joke about Khrushchev makes fun of his love of medals and ribbons. So Comrade Khrushchev visits Egypt. When visiting the Nile, he steps out of his car to get a closer look. His bodyguards are nervous. What if Comrade Khrushchev gets eaten by a crocodile? Whispers a young bodyguard. An older bodyguard stares straight ahead, lights a cigarette, and says, "Well, one thing's for sure. The crocodile will be pooping medals for a month." So sorry about the slightly crass humor there. Thought that was a good one. Here's another one about Khrushchev's medals. So one day, Comrade Khrushchev walks into the Kremlin. That's the Russian Capitol building. And to everyone's amazement, Khrushchev's chest, which is usually full of ribbons and medals, is entirely empty. Finally, someone works up the nerve to ask Khrushchev what happened to all of his medals. Khrushchev looks down and says, "Oh, whoops. I forgot to move them back off of my pajamas this morning." So in the infancy of the communist revolution in Russia, the precepts of communism were held in very high regard. The utopian goals of Marx seemed achievable, and the communist leaders proved willing to take the drastic steps to bring about the revolution as laid out in the Communist Manifesto. However, as the 1900s wore on, problems appeared in both the communist economy and the communist society. Tightly controlled communist economies often suffer from planning mistakes which lead to a constant state of economic depression. As the communist countries of the USSR and China realized the problems with their economies, they adapted aspects of the free market with varying degrees of success. The communist experiment in the 19th century has taught us three important lessons. First, the removal of profit motives leads to economic problems. Second, the removal of competition also leads to economic problems. And third, economic planning cannot adequately replace the natural movements of the free market. First, we're going to examine several problems that develop in communist economies. Communist economic planners tightly control all aspects of a communist economy. They control the factors of production, they control the amounts of goods and services supplied, and finally, they control the delivery of those goods and services to the consumers. All of this requires highly complex planning. Now, as you can imagine, mistakes happen. And when the economic planners in a communist economy underestimate the amount of a particular good or service that the citizenry needs, a shortage occurs. The people in the country, and within that country, either stand in long lines to procure what they need, or they simply do without. On the other hand, if the planners overestimate the amount of a particular good or service, a surplus occurs. Now, that particular surplus rots in a warehouse. So besides planning mistakes, communist economies often suffer from near constant depressions, driven by problems with production and supply, and also inflation. Problems with production and supply in communist countries are typically the result of planning mistakes, as we have already discussed. They're also the result of inefficient use of the factors of production and a lack of worker incentive. Now, inflation in a communist country looks different from inflation in a free market country. In a free market economy, inflation takes place when money either loses its buying or when money loses its buying power, and this happens when prices rise or the money supply increases. On the other hand, inflation in a communist country is not the result of rising prices, since those prices are controlled by the government. Neither is it a result of money being dumped into circulation, since the money supply is already entirely controlled by the government. Instead, inflation in a communist country takes the form of long lines and shortages when people are trying to buy goods and or services. While inflation looks different in market economies and communist economies, the end result is actually the same. The same amount of money now buys fewer goods and services. Next, we'll turn to examine the experiences of two communist countries, the USSR and China. The Communist Revolution started in Russia in 1917. Eventually, Russia extended its control over a group of nations that surrounded it. Collectively, these countries were called the United Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR for short. This group of countries was also called the Soviet Union. I'm just making sure you understand all these terms. So, United Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, Soviet Union, all referring to the same group of nations, or collective nation. In addition to the USSR, several other countries along the USSR's western border were also controlled by Russia, but to a lesser degree than the countries in the Soviet Union. These countries were called the Soviet bloc. Here's a map that shows the USSR and the Soviet bloc. Throughout the history of the USSR, the country's communist leaders caused the deaths of millions of its citizens. One cause of these deaths was the country's attempt to industrialize, which had the effect of causing a nationwide famine. Millions starved to death. Besides starvation, the USSR willfully killed and imprisoned many of its citizens in order to enforce and maintain communist rule and principles. Most of the widespread death in the USSR went undiscovered by the rest of the world for many years. During most of the Cold War, a period of hostility between the United States and the USSR lasting from World War II to about 1990, it was not apparent to the United States that the Soviet Union was an inferior economic or social system. In some ways, the USSR even seemed to surpass the US. However, by the 1980s, definite cracks had begun to form in the communist country. The USSR increasingly struggled to meet the consumption demands of its citizens. With the spread of TV and radio, the imbalance between the living standards of the average citizen in the USSR versus the living standard of the average citizen in the United States became increasingly apparent to the citizens of the USSR. Under pressure from outside the country and from also inside the country, the leaders of the USSR decided to ease restrictions and to adopt aspects of democracy and the free market into their communist system. However, for the USSR, these measures proved too little too late. The USSR began to lose its control of the nations within the Soviet bloc. Perhaps the most iconic example of this collapse of control is the destruction of the Berlin Wall, which took place in 1989. The wall had separated the city into its US-controlled district and the USSR-controlled district for many years. Sensing an easing of pressure, of communist pressure, the citizens of Berlin tore down the wall themselves using hand tools. Clearly, the USSR's power was beginning to crumble. Within several years, the USSR had entirely fallen apart. Now, the countries of the Soviet bloc and the countries of the former USSR, as well as the country of Russia itself, have all headed in different economic and political directions. But here we will specifically focus on Russia. Russia has struggled to entirely adopt a free market economy, as well as a democratic political system. Instead, the Russian economy has settled into a type of oligopoly in which Russian kingpins own and control much of the economy. In some ways, the differences between the economy under communist rule and the economy now are not so great. Russia has also struggled to adopt a democratic political system. Currently, Putin's strongman governing personality sits atop the Russian government and shows no sign of relinquishing his power. In summary, Russia's movement toward a free market and democracy, begun in the 1980s by problems within the communist system, has stalled somewhere between a system of communism and a system of capitalism and democracy. Finally, we'll turn briefly to examine the country of China. The Communist Revolution in China started in the wake of the Japanese defeat in World War II. Mao Zedong led the revolution and successfully established the Communist People's Republic of China in 1949. Like the USSR, China also tried to bring about what it called the Great Leap Forward, in which the country would become an industrial power. Tragically, this movement failed, causing millions of Chinese to starve to death because of production shortages. Also, like in the USSR, China killed and imprisoned millions of its citizens in the name of enforcing communism. However, unlike the USSR, China pursued a policy of open belligerence against capitalistic countries. This attitude difference led to a rift between these two communist neighbors, Russia and China. After Mao Zedong's death in 1976, Chinese communism shifted toward market socialism. The new leader, Deng Xiaoping, adopted aspects of the market economy that he believed had proven themselves to be effective. He is credited with moving the country toward the economic powerhouse that China is today. The Chinese government has also moved toward incorporating more democratic principles into its polity. The Chinese constitution includes civil rights, such as the right of free speech. However, the Chinese government has not actually maintained these rights. Today, China remains a communist power with capitalistic and democratic leanings. Meanwhile, the USSR remains a capitalistic and democratic country with communist leanings. China successfully adapted its brand of communism to meet the growing pressures of the modern world and economy, while the USSR did not. China continues to flourish economically and geopolitically. Russia, on the other hand, is floundering economically and geopolitically. It will remain highly interesting to see how these two countries continue to adapt to the changing world conditions. Finally, we'll turn to observe several lessons we have learned from the communist experiment in the 1900s. First, we learned that removing the profit motive from businesses and individuals lowers the quality and quantity of goods and services produced. Alongside that lesson comes the second. Removing competition from businesses and individuals also lowers the quality and quantity of goods and services produced. Finally, we learned that economic planning cannot adequately understand or properly plan a complex economy. Instead, the end result of a command economy, such as a communist economy, is typically a never-ending depression. Let me close by telling you about the first McDonald's in Moscow, which opened in 1990. At this point in time, the Soviet Union was well on its way toward collapse, but the country remained under communist control, especially in its capital city of Moscow. After much work, McDonald's was able to open a branch in the heart of its greatest enemy. On opening day, January 31, 1990, thousands of Russians lined up to enter the McDonald's. Inside the doors, they were greeted by something they had rarely, if ever, seen before: a smiling person behind the counter. But I guess, to be honest with you, I don't always see that either at McDonald's. However, to the Russian populace, the sight of someone happily serving them seemed suspicious. In fact, when McDonald's put its Russian employees through its training program called Burger University, the employees struggled to understand the concept of greeting customers with a smile and willingly providing the customers with what they wanted. These were foreign concepts to people who lived in an economy not sharpened by profit motives and competition, but rather driven by economic planners who directed the production of goods. McDonald's in Moscow was a smashing success. In Moscow, as in many places around the world, the US has extended its influence not by using guns, tanks, and missiles, but rather by using blue jeans, Big Macs, and Coca-Cola. Mr. Chris, out.